We're very excited to be welcoming Caro back. Caro de Robertis is a writer of Uruguayan origins and the author of 6 novels, many novels that are like huge hits at Word Up, both because they're hits anyway, but also because they're also translated into Spanish. And so we're able to like celebrate them in intergenerational ways. Caro is has won numerous awards, including 2 Stonewall Book Awards, an NEA Fellowship, and the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature, and is also an award-winning literary translator and a professor at San Francisco State University. Sorry, my glasses are fogging up. And Dan Michel, now that I can't read anything, I learned recently is a neighbor of this space, which I'm very, very excited by, and is also, oh my goodness, is our moderator for the evening, and is the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature, winner of the 2022 Whiting Literary Magazine Prize, and the first Black, openly trans woman to helm a major literary publication. Dan Michel's new novel is When the Harvest Comes, and there's also another book to come, and that will be out in August, another anthology that we'll hopefully be able to celebrate then too. Please come up and share with us. Thank you. Also, I just have to say that, I mean, it doesn't quite work to say timely for people that have been around since the beginning of People, but just the fact of this book existing right now, like highlighting, celebrating oral histories of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit is like such a gift, I think, to everybody. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. It's really exciting to be here. I was telling Veronica when I first got here that I just moved to the neighborhood 3 months ago. I literally live directly across the street. So it was an easy commute, but when I moved in and learned that I was right across the street from Word Up, I was like, oh, this could not have worked out better for me.
So amazing. Built immediate community.
And it's my first time living alone. So it's So it's very good. So Caro, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event with you.
Are you kidding? I'm so thrilled and honored. Thank you for being in conversation with me. You know how much I love your work, and you know how much I absolutely love your novel. Y'all, it just came out in April, When the Harvest Comes. It's so good. It's absolutely gorgeous. Buy it. Get her to sign it if you're lucky. Revel in this beautiful, beautiful novel.
Oh my gosh. Well,
We had
thank
to say
you.
that. Yes.
Thank you.
It's so good. I love it.
Thank you.
I've been waiting for it too.
You have been.
Because there's a short story from that was part of the seed of the book that I had been teaching to my students at San Francisco State.
Yes.
And I was telling them,
Yes.
this book could be a novel.
Which
So,
is
thank you for
also
delivering.
in the anthology Everyday People, The Color of Life, if you want to buy another purchase here. A little bit of the novels in there. Well, I'm so grateful because I'm obsessed with so many stars. This book is extraordinary. I was so thrilled to get to read it. And I was telling you earlier that it felt like a hug from the elders. It felt like exactly what we needed, just sort of following up on what Veronica was saying. I feel like it's exactly what we need at this time. And I think my first question for you is if you can talk a little bit about, just sort of in general terms, the spirit of this book and what you wanted to put out into the world with it. Because I can tell you what I felt. I can tell you what I came away from it with, which is just, I feel like it goes everywhere. There are definitely tough moments. The format of the book is our elders are just sort of, it's an oral history. So they're telling you, and it's all mixed in together, which is brilliant. And they go from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows in the matter of a sentence sometimes, or in the matter of the white space in a page break. And it's been a while since I've read a book that I felt so completely held me And it really was a privilege to read. So I wanted to start off generally with like, yeah, what was it that you wanted to get into the world with this book?
Well, thank you. That is so incredible. And I love that it felt like a hug to you, because I also felt when I was collecting these oral histories, which was part of a fellowship project, Baldwin Emerson Fellowship, which was something started by the writer and MacArthur Fellow Jacqueline Woodson. She invited me to be one of a cohort of 10 writers gathering oral histories of elders of color. And my specific beat was queer and trans BIPOC elders. And, I'm traveling to people's kitchens and living rooms and offices in some cases. And I just, as I, had the sort of recording equipment and I've got my questions and I'm doing this deep listening, oral history is a format of interview that is very slow. We got training, right? And so from people who teach in the master's program at Columbia University on oral historians. And oral history as an interview format is very intimate and very slow. There's a leaning into the pauses. There's a leaning into letting people kind of flow towards where their memories are. So you think you're talking about childhood, but then they mention their father, and then now they're 40 years old and something's happening with their father, right? Because that's how memory works. So you're following people as well as offering a shape to draw out sort of these intimate stories that so many of us in our lived experience have, that we might think are ordinary, but actually they're profound. And in the case of trans and gender nonconforming people of color, they speak to history, and they speak to histories that are systemically erased from the archive. So here I am. I'm just, I'm sitting in front of them, and I'm gathering these stories, and I kept having these moments where I was feeling this incredible. The best word I can come up with at the moment for it is sort of grace. Just being in this kind of state of grace, witnessing these deep things that I knew, are underrepresented in official histories and in literary contexts. And so I started to feel this profound hunger to try to weave it into a book. And at least make an attempt to bring that feeling of grace, that feeling of warmth, of connection, of insight, and of there being a lineage, right? And an inheritance for those of us who are trans and gender nonconforming, right? To be able to sort of carry that forward.
I found the focus on the elders to be such a perfect, frame or shape for the book as well, in part because of that question of lineage. I think so much of what's happening right now is the erasure of our lineage, the erasure of our past. There are so many people, there's a common misconception that transness is new. And of course, we know that that's not, but there's so much erasure happening that, people are starting to think that, or are still thinking that, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to ask you about, what it was like talking to these elders that you got to look up to. What was it like creating the intimacy that was needed to get the answers from them? Mm-hmm. Because I can't stress enough how intimate the book really feels. Mm-hmm. I kept thinking, Caro must be some kind of a magician. And I also kept wondering, how long were these interviews that you were able to I just threw a lot of questions at you. I'm sorry. But
no, that's amazing.
I did want to know. I did want to know how long these interviews were.
Yeah, they're not actually that long. They're available online at the Insight Archive to listen to, but they're maybe an average of 2 to 3 hours each person, which when you think about how much breadth of life is inside of them, I don't think that's that long, although, of course, it's some time to spend with someone.
I thought it was
days.
It had to be at least 10 hours for each person. That's what I thought.
Right. Yeah, no, so there is a kind of shaping. Gosh, you just asked so many brilliant questions, and now I'm trying to go back towards the beginning of that thread. What was the first part?
I feel like the beginning of it was just what was it like creating that intimacy with them?
Yes, creating the intimacy. Yeah. that part was really incredible. And there's trust building that goes into this. Reaching out to someone, sometimes there are people that I connected to through networks. So it was like somebody knew somebody, like for example, the amazing writer Julian Delgado Lopera, who now lives in New York, amazing trans Latinx writer, author of Fiebre Tropical. I knew that their trans mother was Adela Vasquez. And I also knew already that Adela Vasquez does not give interviews to everybody, right? Because she's had enough experiences with people being like, oh, you are this trans Latina icon with stories, and then they come and then it's extractive. And we had honoraria, which is not always the case in oral history, but felt really important to come in and not be extractive. But also, Julian had introduced me,
Yeah.
So that was one example. And Adela is actually the only narrator in here who has passed away, which, yeah, I know, she's so full of life in the book, right? At the age of 65, totally unexpectedly. And she actually died in the arms of her chosen family sibling, who's also in the book, Nelson Dalerta Perez. They've been living together since the 80s. I mean, so like to the very, very end, they were family. They're both Cuban refugees. And so Adela, just to give an example, she welcomed me into her home. She was all dressed up like a queen, and she's like, hello, come upstairs. And she, it's like one of those Victorians with the stairs, and she had stayed up really late the night before baking a cake from scratch to serve me before our interview, and she'd made little finger sandwiches, and she had the porcelain cups and the tea, and we were going to do the interview in the living room, but we had to go to the kitchen, and I had to sit down with it was all for us. Wow. It was all for me.
You in the interview.
Yes, she did. I mean, this sort of
iconic.
This iconic, famous trans mother. What's she gonna do? What's she gonna do? She's like, you're in my house.
She's gonna feed you.
Do you like the sandwiches? Está rica la torta, ver dime, And so we had a conversation over tea, and the light changed, and that was part of kind of making our way into the interview. And then Bambi Salcedo is somebody I did not have direct contact with, but of course I went through my own networks, which I'm really fortunate to be very rich in community among trans and queer people of color. But I also wanted to make sure I had good representation, so I did my own research and I reached out to people cold. Bambi Salcedo, as another example, is also completely iconic. She's the founder of the Trans Latina Coalition. She's still the director there. She's been on like HBO's Trans List. She's had her own documentary made about her. I mean, Bambi is, a major community figure. She said yes to an interview. I flew down to LA for the interview with the support of the fellowship, and she gave me 2 hours. This woman is so busy. She's like, no more, no less. But I get there. She's a little late, and even though we only have 2 hours, she introduced me to every single trans woman working in that office. It was like, y esta es Jessica, hola Jessica, encantada, like meeting everybody, because that was another kind of way of like hosting, and like, you're welcome to, here you are, you're at the Trans Latina Coalition.
Mothering.
And then even with Bambi, if I can just tell one more quick story about this, is that the slowing down, the oral history slowing down, even though Bambi, I watched all the footage I could of her being interviewed before I went, but she told me a story. So I asked every single person the question, I asked every single one to tell a story of a time when they experienced gender euphoria in their childhood, when they experienced something that gave them sort of the joy or well-being or delight of knowing their true gender, which for everybody was in a context where they didn't have a lexicon for who they were. So part of it is like, how did you do it? What was it like for you, pre-language in a way? And when I asked Bambi that question, she told me that story about being 12 years old, and she had already been subject to street violence, sexual violence, poverty, all of these terrible things in Guadalajara, Mexico. But she also befriended a group of queer kids in the park. And they said, we're going to this gay party at this underground gay organization tonight. You should come. And they go to a house and get dressed. And she's 12 years old. And she puts on a dress for the first time. And it's a white dress. And she feels so beautiful. She feels like Cinderella. And when she told me that story, it was the only time in the interview when she cried. All these other traumas, incarceration, like ICE, so many rapes, sex work. This was the time that she cried. And I just sat with her. We sat in silence for a while, just being together, remembering the white dress.
That, first of all, that deserves a moment of silence. But this is going to sound very woo-woo, and I'm not generally a very woo-woo person.
It's okay, I'm a California writer, so I'll wherever you're going, I'm there.
This book is this book is spiritual. It is spiritual. It is of another realm, and you feel like you are reading the words and hearing the stories of something that is of the divine. You really do. And that, I think, is the nature of the intimacy that is yielded in these conversations. You feel like you're reading people's hearts. It's amazing. I can't stop talking about how amazing this book is.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Like,
Dan Michelle, thank you
it's incredible.
so much.
That's not hyperbole.
Wow.
When you read it, you will know. So that, I think, is maybe a good transition into asking if you'll read something from the book for us.
Oh my God, okay. What a transition. Thank you. Turns out I really needed that. Little did I know. Oh my God. Okay, should I read from the beginning, Glimmers in Childhood? Should I read them riffing on what is gender, or the end, Visions from the Future? What do you think, Michelle?
Oh God, I don't know. Those are three of my favorite sections.
Ooh. Okay.
Maybe Glimmers in Childhood.
Okay. I'll just read a little bit from the very beginning, chapter 1. Glimmers in Childhood. We open with Adela Vasquez. May she rest in power. Adela Vasquez. I knew from the very beginning, from the age of 4. Tupili Lea Arellano. I knew very early. I didn't have the verbal cognition, but I knew I was different. I never said I wanted to be a boy, but I didn't want to be a girl. I didn't want to be either or. You know what I'm saying? Josenio Lewis. I knew from day one, the moment of consciousness, that I was different. I was aware that I was a problem for some people. In my world, I was a boy. I played with boys, I was a boy, and that's all there was to it. Storm Miguel Flores. Everybody thought I wanted to be a boy. That just felt foreign to me, to want to be another gender. It felt wrong and embarrassing in some way, and I don't even remember secretly feeling like I wanted to be a boy. I just felt like I wanted to be who I am. Joan Benoit. Oh my God, I've always been read as queer, from a young age. I distinctly remember a day when I was 7 years old. My great-grandmother was in from the reservation. At that point, great-grandma must have been in her 80s, early 90s. She was from the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. She was in Michigan as a young person, born and raised with traditional ways. When the French came, she and her family went to Canada to try to avoid being put on a reservation, and she didn't get put on a reserve until she was in her 20s. She was my mom's grandma. She was cool. Grandma Rose. I have a picture of her somewhere. We were visiting, and she said to my mom, I was sitting on my mom's lap, she said, I thought you had 3 boys and 2 girls. And my mom said, I do. And she said, oh, this one here's a special one. You need to pay attention. Like she knew who I was. She said it and looked me right in the eye. She knew me. My mom spent her life ignoring the traditional teachings. She was trying to assimilate. Out of all my siblings, I think I'm the most Native identified. I'm Anishinaabe from Michigan, an Ojibwe woman. It's always gone back to the traditional ways and not the colonizers' ways. The way I build community and the way I try to carry myself, it's an understanding that I'm going to be an ancestor just like them. That's a lot of the work around identifying as Two-Spirit. There are teachings that we need to bring back. My parents didn't get me. I felt misunderstood my whole life by them. And then my great-grandmother understood who I was. I've carried that moment with me my whole life. Thank you.
Gorgeous. That line, there are lessons that we need to bring back.
Right. Right. And so like one of the bringing that story as one of the longer stories at the beginning of the first chapter was part of it was wanting to lead with indigeneity and center indigeneity in a book about the United States, right? And then part of it is a 7 years old first being seen moment, but then also it ties to this idea that two-spirit understanding has ancient roots, right? So it's this understanding of like, it's not about, I loved what you said earlier about, absolutely there is this idea in the dominant culture in the mainstream, and it's enforced by the media, that transness and non-binariness are inventions of the young. They're a fad that can be easily dismissed, and nothing could be further from the truth, right? And so the indigenous folks in this book are really holding that knowledge in this ancient way. It's about bringing back what has been erased as opposed to an invention.
Yeah, which is exceptionally relevant right now, as we know. Can you talk a little bit about the process, the work? Can you talk a little bit about the process of taking these many and varied interviews and histories and narratives and weaving them into this collective narrative, bringing these voices together the way that you did? I'm not a person who was terribly familiar with anything in oral histories or tradition prior to this. And up until I opened my galley of the book, I assumed that each chapter was gonna be like an essay from one person in sort of like an as told by format. Right. And so then when I read the first chapter, I was like, oh, this is such a cool, interesting thing that Caro has done for the first chapter. And then when I got to the second chapter, I was like, oh, this is the format for the whole book. And I was like, and it's genius and amazing. And immediately I was on your behalf a little overwhelmed at what it must have taken to do that, because there are sections that are paragraphs that are coming from like two different narrators, and like one of them will end on a sentence and the next person begins and it's as though they're in conversation. There are moments that will feel as though you were sitting at a round table hearing these elders in a conversation with each other, and you're just like a fly on the wall. And I just was like, God, what it must have taken to take all of this material and weave that into something so beautiful. What was that like? What was the process?
I'm almost embarrassed to say this because I feel like I should say it was really hard, and I was down there in the salt mines and I really, so the truth is a little embarrassing. It was delightful. It wasn't always easy, but it was exhilarating. It felt like such a beautiful, profound process. And I think, as writers, we're often, we're creating the words, and then we're also shaping and sculpting. And I don't know about you, but how you get your exquisite work done, but you have it, and I know there's other amazing writers in the room who could maybe speak to this, but there's the generating where you're creating the words, and then you're sculpting the words and editing and revision, which Toni Morrison always said was her favorite part because there was like something to work with. And so it just felt like still working linguistically, but in the revision space, and in a manner that was in service to other people's voices. And so what I was able to bring in there was like my literary translator side. I realized, halfway through working on the book, I was like, I'm bringing this other toolbox. The novelist toolbox is helping me make a narrative arc out of this, like shape a story, think about narrative tension through different events. But the literary translator toolbox is about using the artfulness of language and your own capacity, to the extent you have it, of artistry with language in a manner that's in service to someone else's voice, right? So there's that. In terms of like the structure, I also thought going in that I was going to do that, sort of like a chapter per person. That's what when I first had that sort of urgent feeling that I described of, I really want to bring this into a book. And I have to give huge props to my amazing agent, Michelle Brower, because I said to her, look, I'm really thinking about this idea of this oral history. And she said, the first thing you need to do is read Please Kill Me, an oral history of punk. And that book is structured in this way where it's everybody's little voice and it's these thematic chapters and it reads like a novel and it's a story told in many voices. And I went, oh, we could do this. Then I took a deep dive with Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize in literature for oral history work, sort of really lifting up like oral history writing can be, of that caliber. And so her book, for example, Voices in Chernobyl, she interviewed all these people who were impacted by Chernobyl in different ways. And then she creates this collective, and it's like the community itself is the protagonist. And once I read that, I was just sold. I was like, oh, what if I could do that? I didn't think I could pull it off, but I really wanted.
You can pull off anything.
But I really wanted to try. And so that's when I started going through the transcripts and pulling things out and going, which bucket might this go in? Okay, this is childhood. This is relationship to family. This is chosen family, transition, activism. Art. I put art and drag in a bucket together at first. Yes. I thought that was going to be one chapter, but there was so much about the art and power of drag in this generation and its intersection with, gender exploration and art making, but also in activism. And, so drag insisted on being its own chapter. So there were some changes,
Drag will always insist on being its own chapter.
Drag insisted on taking up space in this amazing, glamorous way. But yeah, so but then even intercutting, like you said, like people's voices, organizing it so that it feels like they're talking to each other, even though they weren't in a room together. Like Fresh Lev White talks about being a drag king, being like the first known black drag king in DC. I think he was the first drag king in DC. And then Landa Lake says, there were so few drag kings, and people didn't talk about drag kings back then. So it sounds like they're riffing with each other, but Landa was talking, about her own relationship to drag. So things like that. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's just an amazing literary feat. First of all, it really is. But I also think it works on so many levels because I'm not making multiple points here, but because it's like these stories and these lives are all so unique and all so different and all so distinct, and yet there are major running themes through all of them, and there's common ground. And I think there's something spiritual to this idea that in different places at different times, these elders are saying things that so easily come together and make up a narrative. And it speaks to the power of the collective, shared experience and collective experience. It speaks to the trauma that many of us hold, and the work that we do to let go of it, which these folks have done.
Right, in so many ways, and in ways that are so hard won, right? And when they had so much less, community infrastructure in terms of queer and trans visibility and community and even a lexicon and, community spaces, right? There's people in there talking about, Ms. Billy Cooper is like, I was a trans activist before we were transgender. We weren't called transgender. We didn't have that word. And I was already an activist for us, and it was the LG organization. That's it. It was LG.
LG.
That's where we were.
That's where we were. We believed in the binary.
Yeah, right. We queers have gotten better at questioning the binary within our own communities.
Yeah, we're expansive. Expansiveness is at the heart of queerness, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those community evolutions, I think, are really important things to note and mark when we look at the incredibly brutal times we're living in right now, right? There is this vicious backlash. The right wing is, in the horrible place that it is. We're all dealing with it. We see the news. And yet still we have made so much progress in terms of the unfurling of the glorious multivalent possibilities of our communities. And it's been happening for generations, and we're here.
Yeah, and we're here.
Yeah.
We're still here.
Yes.
Sort of on that note, I wondered if, and it could be, it could be something from the book. It could be maybe something that didn't make it into the book. I wonder if you could share what, one or two of your favorite sort of moments of triumph that you uncovered in this process.
Ooh, moments of
for
triumph.
folks. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm using a broad definition of the word triumph.
So actually, okay, yes. Okay, I'll just say the first one. The first triumph that jumped to mind in this book is Sharon Grayson's mother. So Sharon Grayson is a Black trans woman in her late 70s, and she actually transitioned in the 1960s, which we just do not get to hear enough about. And she grew up in Houston, Texas. And there are definitely stories in this book about not being seen by your parents, by your family of origin, having to leave your community. And there are many complicated, painful stories that deserve visibility. But she's a counter to that. And she tells this story about that we do not get to hear enough about, like, a Black lady in Texas in the 1950s supporting her child, right? At 14 years old, this is the 1950s, she sits her child down and says, look, I see you. I know you're different. I know you're feminine and this is who you are. And I love you. And I'm going to support you no matter what. The only thing that makes me sad is that it's hard enough to be Black in a world like this one. But now you've got to carry this thing too, but I'm here. Totally embraced her child. And I'm like, if Sharon Grayson's mother could do that in the 1950s, that's just like a map for us all to follow. And then later in the Chosen Family section, I have another story where Sharon Grayson's mom moves with her to LA. So now Sharon's transitioned. She's made community with queer and trans folks. She comes home. This is LA, so everybody drives, right? She comes home and there's cars everywhere. She can't park. She parks a block away from her house. She walks up the door house. She's like, what is going on? Why are there all these cars here? She goes, all her young friends are around the table with her mom. And her mom's like, how you doing, baby? How was your day? Do you want something to eat? What happened? Let's talk about it. Just like mothering everybody. And Sharon kind of, pokes them like, hey, that's my mom. That's not your mom. What are you doing? But really, she was like so proud. And she said, my mom mothered everybody, people who'd been thrown on the street by their families and who later said, if it hadn't been for your mom, I might not be here. So that feels like a triumph story.
Absolutely.
Right? Even though it's like also an everyday story, because our triumphs can be every day.
Our triumphs can be every day, and they are every day. I felt like this book was filled with trans triumph.
Yes.
And
oh, good.
And that was part of what made it so comforting. And I don't know. I have so many more questions. I'm thinking about.
Well, there's triumph that comes out of pain too.
Yes.
Like, do you mind if I tell one more?
Oh my God, no.
Because what jumps to mind is Chino Scott Chung is maybe an example of another triumph that's sort of at a hard cost. So Chino is a trans man, Chinese origin, and he came to the Bay Area after growing up in Colorado. He joined the army to come out as a lesbian. Then he made it to the Bay Area, and he became part of the very groundbreaking API lesbian community there, living as a butch lesbian for some time. And then in the 90s, he met somebody called Christopher Lee, who was the first person that he ever met to say, call me he, reading it at the time as a butch lesbian. And there was Chris catalyzed a whole conversation in this lesbian community about what does it mean if somebody masculine says, I want you to call me he, are we going to do it? And people were like, we have to support him. And Chino was like, I'm not going to, this is a trans man who doesn't know that about himself yet. And he is honest. He's like, at the time I was like, I'm not going to do that. What is Chris talking about? But then they became best friends to the point where when Christopher Lee in 2012 took his own life, Chino was his power of attorney, and it was an absolutely wrenching, wrenching experience. Chino found him. It was incredibly and sad, but Christopher had also transitioned in all of these different ways, and then he just didn't make it. And when the coroner gave the death certificate to Chino, it said F. It said the letter F on it, even though Christopher had changed all of his documentation to male legally. They just looked at anatomy. And Chino went back to the coroner and said, you need to change this document. My friend is male. He made it very clear those were his wishes. I have a notarized paper saying those are his wishes. And they said, sorry, it doesn't matter. They just look at anatomy. So Christopher took that pain, Chino the narrator in the book, took that pain and went to the Transgender Law Center and worked with a lawyer there, testified in front of the California State Senate, and changed the law in California for trans folks to be able to have their true gender on their death certificates. It's called the Christopher Lee Bill. And that bill then went on to catalyze lots of other documentation rights for trans folks in the state of California. And what happens in California often filters out to other states. So I tell that story to say, sometimes the triumph is alongside the pain or has seeds in the soil of the pain. Just like sometimes our trans and queer joy sometimes has seeds in the soil of pain, but we keep tilling and growing and watering and making amazing things.
God, and it makes it all the sweeter, all the more triumphant to live those moments when we know that so often they come from such pain. Yeah.
So trans and queer people we know how to endure. We know how to endure around the right wingness.
Yeah.
The forces that don't want us to exist. Just like people of color, just like Latinx folks, Black folks, many of us belong to communities, and even if we don't belong to those communities, we have access to books with the voices of those communities that we can turn to, right, for hopefully inspiration, sustenance, reminders, solace, animo, to remember that there are ways to continue to, boldly and radiantly exist even in the face of attempts at our erasure.
Yes. Attempts that will fail.
Yes, they will fail.
And we know they will fail because we exist and we continue to exist. But we do need these stories. And I have to say, I do feel like we are in a moment where the book world and publishing they're like meeting the moment. There have never been so many books published by trans authors as there are this year. It's extraordinary, and people have been talking about it, and it's been documented, and there are several incredible anthologies, and it's just it is a moment, and I hate
there is a trans literary explosion happening that's so inspiring. Yeah. And we are in the moment, and I have to say, I feel like publishing, I want to take my hats off to people in publishing. And this is my moment to say that there are some people in this room who are my absolute heroes who work at Algonquin. Najeli Nieto, Cara Bremer, Madeline Jones, and Marisol Salomon. Can you just raise your hands for just 1 second? Because really, you are absolutely my heroes. They have been such champions of this book, including in a moment when it felt like a lot of people in a lot of institutions all over this country were obeying in advance. And going silent on things. And, so I just want to, thank you and salute you, because I think every little thing we do and every little step we take matters. That's one of the things I learned doing this. Like, I'd hear people tell these little everyday stories, and I'm like, wow, that little everyday story from the 70s, I can see how that helped shape the world where I am more possible. So that we're doing that now, we're the ancestors of the future.
This book will you'll just be thinking that through the entire time as you, it's just everything. It's just everything. I'm not even, I think of any book I've read this year, it just completely blew me away. Everything about all of this. It's just, you feel like you're being wrapped up in a warm blanket of trans love, and it's just amazing. I have one more question for you, and then I am thinking maybe it's a good moment to see if there are audience questions. But I wanted to ask, I'm obsessed with how the book is structured, and I'm obsessed with each of the sections. And I wondered if, and as I was reading it, I was thinking about moments in my life that relate to who I am today that I hadn't ever given any thought to. But because I was reading this book and reading these stories, I was like, oh, something like that happened to me too, or someone said this to me at this point, and now I know what that meant. And I just wondered if there was anything in your life that relates to, like, if you were in the book, if you were one of the elders in the book, is there something that you'd share from your life that might relate to one of the sections?
You know what's funny about that is that these are elders, and elder was defined as 50 plus, which I know, 50 plus. And we were in a cohort that included writers who were over the age of 50. And I remember we were on a Zoom and in the training, and it was like, you know, some of the people were like, they were feeling some kind of way. They were like, wait, what? Wait, what? Where? Who's an elder? You know. But Jacqueline Woodson pointed out, she was like, we have to start early with our elders because, you know, people of color, queer and trans folks don't always live as long as we want them to. And we have to capture those stories when we can. And also I think queer and trans elderhood also happens earlier in a way because the culture evolves so much in 10 and 20 years. Like coming out as a trans guy 20 years ago to today is like a completely different cultural universe. Right? And so young trans and non-binary folks from today can learn so much from someone who transitioned 20 years ago, just like how different it was and what the commonalities are. But I say all of that to say, I turned 50 this summer.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Happy early birthday.
Thank you.
I hope you're doing something special.
This is my 50th. This is like the beginning of my 50th birthday party right here. It's so good. All right. Yeah. It's going to be good. And so I'm thinking a lot about like moving through that portal. So that answers the question about like if I were in the book. More to say, I'm noticing how, you know, we're all headed in that direction. If we're lucky, if we're fortunate enough, we will all become elders.
Yes.
Right? And it's very profound to gather the stories of people who've lived longer than you, right? And who might share those cultural experiences. I think what I'll say about that is on a personal level, like I really wanted this project, both the oral history archive itself and the book, I wanted it to be about so much more than me. I didn't want it to be about me or for me. And I was really conscious of that, like even as a person who has a very queer gender, right? My gender itself is so queer. I'm not a binary person. Like I'm not a trans man. I love my people who are trans men. I'm not agender at all. When people talk about their non-binaries as being agender, I love that we have that word. We don't really have a word for the opposite of agender, which is kind of where I am. I'm like mucho gender. You know, I'm like
all the gender.
Super pero muy gender is like
as much gender as possible.
Is like my gender, you know. So we're not done. So clearly we're not done proliferating the lexicon of queer words, right? So
the alphabet soup will be longer.
Yes,
as it should be.
And so for me, actually, like coming up in the 90s, where the categories of gender and queerness, even the category of butch was so fixed, I couldn't always locate myself in it, especially when it was like dominated by a kind of white cultural lexicon, which as a Latinx person, like I couldn't quite find myself.
Which is also talked about, I think, really beautifully in the book.
It is,
in
right?
ways that I was like, I love that people were having these conversations about the racialized aspect of this in like the 90s, the 80s, like the different decades in which these people were having these conversations.
Right, like Tupili, Leia Arellano talks about that with like these lesbians who are like, you're being too male and that's patriarchal and I don't like your masculinity and they're like, you're in boots and plaid. Like, what are you? No, who are you? You just don't like you're being racist. Like, you don't like my Latinx masculinity is what that is, you know? So that was an interesting one.
Got to call it out.
But she's still, you know, anyway. So I think for myself, you know, coming up in the 90s that way, like it took me a long time to find like the full permission to fully be, even as a person who is openly queer all my life, to fully be like, oh, I actually have mucho super gender in me that I'm going to, what if I like pulled up the floorboards and opened the basement in which like my whole gender has been just like waiting and just give myself permission. And I did, and it was like, you know, I was not prepared for how transformative it was, like how profound it was, how much change it catalyzed in my life, including the end of my 20-year gay marriage. That was interesting. And, you know, it was just like catalyzed by the sort of the enormity of change. But also the gender euphoria that I experienced that I didn't even know was possible. Like I didn't know it was possible to feel that alive in my body. I was like, does everybody feel this alive in their body? Or like, does everybody get this much fierce euphoria from, or is this a hard-earned thing of being trans?
I like to think it's a hard-earned thing of being trans. I love our allies and friends. Personally, I feel like you don't maybe deserve this very specific euphoria. Although if you have it, no shade.
Okay.
No shade.
So
this
you
is
know,
just for us.
I know it's a special thing for us when it hasn't been allowed to be fully present in your body. Like, so I read this book, P. Carl's Becoming a Man, which is a trans memoir, and he talked about how he was dissociated from his body like his whole life until he transitioned, and then he could feel everything. I was like, oh yeah, I don't know that I was completely dissociated, but like low key, you know. And then when that living. That's when I understood, oh, actually, you know, gender euphoria is a power source, as I wrote in the essay that's coming out in the Both Hand anthology. So you've read that essay. So you know, I'm like, this is one of my things I think about a lot. And it really is this incredible power source, and the profundity of the joy and possibility that comes from being your whole entire self, completely regardless of how other people might perceive you, whether you're legible to others, whether they hate you, whether they don't want you to exist, they don't want to be your mama anymore. Like, all of that stuff just kind of falls away in the realm of like your inner vast cosmic possibility. And you were asking about the book, and I went elsewhere. But I guess I would just say, for me, like the chapter on transitions, where people talk about, you know, the joy of going on testosterone or how they feel about certain kinds of physical transitions, but also talk about the many different kinds. It's almost a spiritual chapter, right? It's like the spirituality of what transition means. And like Miss Billy Cooper is like, I transitioned my whole life. It's not one day. And I reserve the right to transition all my life. And Crystal Mason is like, I create myself all the time. I'm always creating myself. And if I'm lucky, I will create myself until the day I die. Right? And that's something I think we can all have. So so in that chapter, and I think in the What is Gender chapter, which is also a very cosmic chapter to me, right? Where people have all these things to say, I feel like, I locate myself in so many of the things that people say, and doing that was so healing for me. Yeah. I'm not sure I answered your question.
You answered it perfectly. And this is, I think what I hope to get across, what I want to get across is that everyone, and even not just our trans and non-binary and gender expansive people, but everyone, you will locate yourself in here. At least in one place, if you're at all like me, on like every page. On every page. And it's such a feat. And just hats off to you. I want to make sure we get any questions that are here from the audience, so let's do that.
Hi. Okay, so my question is about the audiobook, because you narrated, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
correct?
I did.
Okay, great. So I find it really interesting that the focus of the book is about oral history, and then, you know, you've taken the oral and you turn it into text, and then there's this other layer of oral, of listening to you read those stories to us. So I guess my question is, like, what was that like for you to take something that was meant that you translated so beautifully in text, and then to have to, I guess it's a big, like, pressure. To me, I feel pressure, like, oh my gosh, now I have to say these stories with like the cadence and, you know, and give it some level of the integrity that you were recording. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. Luckily for me, I'd had some practice recording my novels previously, which is not the same, but this is something I really love about being able to voice a book. I think because I think literary history is rooted in the oral tradition, you know, in this like a fundamental way. It is interesting that it was an oral spoken thing and then got translated to text. It's almost like it's like translating something from the Russian to the French to the Vietnamese or something. You know, it's sort of a multi-step process. But the truth is, the translation is pretty significant from the oral spoken to the page, because people repeat themselves, and sometimes I kept certain repetitions or verbal tics in the text because I wanted people to feel it. You know, like in the chapter on thoughts for younger generations, when KB Boyce says, you know, we are the dreams of our ancestors. Yeah, Like I kept that, you know, even though technically you could have sliced it off, you know. Where do you put a comma? Where do you put a period? Where do you put a line break? It's almost like doing a kind of erasure poetry to try to capture it on the page to live in a different way. So it becomes something different once it's written. In other words, you can't use the original audio because it's actually different from the original audio in a way that hopefully preserves the spirit of it and translates the spirit to live on the page. And so then voicing it, you know, I didn't want to like exaggerate people's voices because I don't want it to sound in any way like anything close to caricature, right? Because I have such immense love and respect for every single one of these 20 people. Like I love them so much. And I feel like they've given us so much, you know. So I really wanted to make sure it was a tribute. But I was able to do a little bit of voice variance that I hope works because I remember their voices and I remember how they talk, you know. And so some of them are very, very beautifully thoughtful, you know, and really like deep with meaning. Like Vivian Varela, you know, she's so sincere. And then there's people who are really salty, you know, like Adela Vasquez. You know, there's this point that's in Visions for the Future where she's like, you know, yeah, the right wing is here, but you know, they're not gonna make queers go back in the closet. Like queers aren't going back in the closet. You think queers are gonna give up what we have? We're gonna say no, child. Fuck you. Get off my dress. You're not going to oppress me. You know, I mean, I can hear her still saying it. You know, I mean, and that's just part of her personality. So I tried to, you know, balance neutrality with like bringing a little bit of their spirit as well. Hi.
I'd love to hear about how you picked the cover.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a collaboration with the publisher. So the publisher kind of proposes a cover, makes a design. I mean, you know, I'm not a visual designer, really not a painter. You know, I'm just not, I don't artistically think in visuals, so I'm always extremely impressed when people can do that. I'm really grateful that there is a team that kind of works on the visual design. But this was the first proposal, and I honestly loved it. And one of the things that I really love about it, first of all, is of course the stars. And I, you know, the fact that it is the So Many Stars, which, you know, the title comes from something that someone says in the book, Crystal Mason, when I asked them what it meant to them to use they, them pronouns and start using them in their 60s. They told this story about if you look at the night sky in the country, you look up and you see so many stars, and the more stars there are, the more possibilities there are. When we create new language, new pronouns, new possible ways of being, it's just more possibility and someone feels less alone. And I was like, okay. I remember sitting in front of them and going, okay, if I ever manage to pull off a book, maybe that's the title. Like in that moment, you know? So I loved the stars being there. I do feel like there's kind of, I don't know if anyone else sees this, but I see kind of subtext of the American flag with the lines of stars, which I think is really powerful. And then finally, there was a strong piece for me about the subtitle is so big, like it's all letters, you know, but what that means is the word trans is right there, right? The word non-binary is right there with you, right? Like people of color, like that's what you'll find here. And honestly, I've had some experiences with other publishers, not this one, in publishing in the old days, there was a real desire to hide queer content, hide trans content. You know, I published a book 10 years ago. It's turning 10, and looks like I'm finally gonna be able to get the Stonewall Book Award seal on the cover, because 10 years ago my publisher didn't want to put the seal on it because it would make the book look gay. And I was like, 10 years ago? This is a 2015 book. The paperback was 2016, not that long ago, and they were like, it has a pink triangle on it, the Stonewall seal. And I'm like, I'm very proud to have a Stonewall. Plus, it's given by gay librarians. I'm like, this is gay librarians. How are they not your heroes? I mean, you know. So... But anyway, they didn't. I'm just telling the story now. This is. I'm almost 50. Look, I'm ready to just like be really blunt. Yeah. and be real.
We give no fucks.
That's what happens.
it's-
I've been hearing about from my friends in their 50s that this happens.
Yeah.
No fucks left to give.
What is
and
it?
suddenly you're telling on your old publisher in public. Oh.
Yeah. Well, what does
Yeah.
it say about the fact that I feel that way, and I'm a little bit younger than that?
It's good. You're precocious. It's excellent. It's start early. Start early. So anyway, that was a fight about and I didn't get the seal. The seal, the Gods of Tango still does not have a Stonewall Book Award seal on it yet, because they were ashamed or they thought that it would turn straight people away, and that's not. We didn't want that. So anyway, this feels like such a different spirit to say we want to make sure that people know that this is a book where you can see trans. This is a book where you can read non-binary. This is a book where you can hear people of color. We want people to know that. And the colors, for me really do that. So thank you, Algonquin.
And we, not just us, but we have to make sure that it continues to move in this direction and doesn't move back to that direction.
Get off my dress. I mean, I don't want to wear a dress.
I do.
Get off Adela's dress. Get off Ben Michelle's dress. Yeah, that's right. Get off my wingtips.
Yeah, truly. I see another question. Do we have time for one more? Seems like, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Pink glasses, I think. Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to let you know I will be calling that publisher.
Oh dear. Oh no. What have I done?
Good. They need to hear about it. They need to know.
Actually, I need to say there's a new person at the publisher who is now changing it and queering it up. It's happening now. So yes, there's no need to get mad at them now. But thank you. I really appreciate it. The people who are there now are actually like, oh, what is this? We have this, queer
board,
book
yeah.
that, people see it as a lesbian book and I wrote a transmasculine book before I knew I was transmasculine. Like, people come up to me now and are like, thank you for this transmasculine novel. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't know I was, but yeah, it is.
That's amazing.
So anyway, we're good today. But it is an important part, I think, of history, publishing history, not even that long ago, that is how things often were.
Yeah, 2015, at the end of the second Obama administration. That's just feels crazy to me. I used to see books with that triangle in the library at my school, which I realize now is really impressive for the high school that I was in. And I was like, oh, I can read this and feel okay. And also, it's okay for me to read this in this school.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just wild to me that in 2015, that's wild.
Yeah.
Anyway, were there any more questions?
My name is Shakira, and I just want to say I'm a big fan.
I have no idea why that's funny. Shakira Diaz, acclaimed author of Ordinary Girls and the upcoming incredibly good debut novel, This Is the Only Kingdom. It's so good, y'all. Yeah, it comes out in October. That's the cover. Anyway, I don't know why that's funny. Nice to meet you, Shakira.
Nice to meet you too. I brought that in my wallet.
As one does.
Since we're talking about your other books, since there are other fans in the audience, we're really curious about when the sequel to The Palace of Eros is coming out.
Excuse me, what? I have no idea. That's amazing. What an amazing thought. A sequel. What would be in the sequel?
Sex?
More sex.
Yeah. Which we can always use.
More sex. Okay,
always use
I'll
more
think
sex.
about it. I'm working on a novel now. It has lesbian nun sex. Does that help?
Yes.
Does this help? Lesbian genderqueer nun sex? Because
Yes.
I'm writing it, so. Okay.
We stand. That does sound sound amazing.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
that's amazing. But I wouldn't be mad at a sequel for The Palace of Ferris either.
Aw.
Just saying.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I think on that note, I'm just gonna say again, thank you to Word Up for hosting us at this incredible space with this incredible audience. Thank you to Caro for this incredible book that will have you weeping at many turns. Thank you for bringing these elders into our lives. There was only one name that I knew before reading this book, so it was really, really amazing for me to just like dive in and read all of it. And it's just such a gift. So thank you for writing it, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you so much, Den Michelle.